This is DW News Africa. Coming up on the program, why is Russia looking to increase its influence in Africa? The Kremlin says the Russian presence on the continent is growing as it reveals plans to boost military and economic ties. We'll look at where and how. Also coming up on the show, are they staying or have they gone? Wagner, Russia's best-known paramilitary group, says it's leaving Mali, claiming mission accomplished. We'll look at what's been achieved, helping the country's military government fight off a jihadist insurgency. Plus, we'll have a special report on the growing cult of Burkina Faso's junta leader and find out why Ibrahim Traore is so popular. I'm Michael Oku. Welcome to the program. What does Russia want from Africa? For many years, the Kremlin was content to let Wagner, Russia's best-known mercenary group, call the shots in countries like Mali. But now Wagner says it has pulled out of the Sahel nation. Its units there taken over by the Africa Corps, a paramilitary group overseen by Moscow's defense ministry. Analysts say up to 80% of the Africa Corps are former Wagner fighters. When asked about the withdrawal, Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov gave a clear statement of Russia's ambitions in Africa.
The Russian presence in Africa is growing. We really intend to comprehensively develop our interaction with African countries, focusing primarily on economic and investment interaction. And this cooperation also extends to such sensitive areas as defense and security. In this regard, Russia will also continue to interact with African states.
So where has Russia and its paramilitary forces from Wagner and the Africa Corps already been active in Africa? Let's take a look. Wagner has been in the Central African Republic since 2018, protecting President Faustin Archange Touadéra. In November last year, they expanded their footprint to Equatorial Guinea, where they also provide security for the president. Wagner also had brief stints providing military and political security in Madagascar and Mozambique. And they've been reported as operational in Libya and Sudan. But it is in the alliance of Sahel states, Niger, Burkina Faso, and Mali, that Russian influence is most profound and deepening. All three nations have recently experienced coups and broken off long-standing security ties with the U.S. and other Western powers. Mali, ruled by a junta that seized power in coups in 2020 and 2021, has never officially admitted Wagner's presence there, only saying it works with Russian instructors. But its military leaders and their supporters welcomed Russian support as they pushed for the withdrawal of French forces, the country's former colonial power. After 3.5 years in Mali, Wagner claims to have brought all regional capitals under the control of the Malian army and to have killed thousands of militants and their commanders. But is it really mission accomplished? Well, Wagner's withdrawal comes amid what the Malian army is calling a resurgence of jihadist attacks. This footage claims to show militants raiding a military base in Mali's Mopti region earlier this month. An al-Qaeda-linked group claims it was behind the attack. The incident, part of a wider pattern of escalating violence in the Sahel region. For more on all things Wagner and Mali, let's bring in Beverly Ochieng, analyst with the think tank, the Center for Strategic and International Studies. She joins us from Dakar, Senegal. Beverly, Moscow says the Wagner Group is leaving Mali because its mission accomplished there. I put it to you, is the job done?
Not quite yet, because the insurgency in Mali has continued. We have seen continued attacks, particularly by the Al-Qaeda group, as well as Islamic State, a spread of the militancy from just the north and central towards the west and the southern regions, which wasn't the case just before the Wagner Group itself had arrived in the country. So right now it feels more as if Russia is trying to consolidate control over paramilitaries, because the Wagner Group was seen as a counter force or as a sort of power struggle between what the Russian Defense Ministry wants to achieve in the region, while the Wagner Group was rather semi-autonomous, particularly after the death of its founder.
Again, there are credible reports that up to 80% of the Africa Corps, that Russian paramilitary force replacing Wagner, are former Wagner members themselves. Does this transition indicate genuine change in Moscow's approach, or is it simply a rebranding by Russia, an opportunity to distance from the Wagner name while maintaining influence in the region?
Yes, it does feel as if Russia wants to move away from some of Wagner's tactics, and part of it was concerns about operational command, concerns around human rights abuses, and even heavy-handed tactics while carrying out counterinsurgency operations. But the fact that it still is with members from that former paramilitary force, the Wagner Group, means that there will be a need for reorientation. There might be a need for thinking around what the strategy and visibility of the paramilitaries is in the region, because Malian authorities themselves have often repeatedly said they're not receiving support from what attempt to be mercenaries, but rather they're working with military instructors. So it might be a more formalized approach of security, but not so much a change of tactics or even in the successfulness of ground operations.
Let's talk about the Kremlin soft power, from education programs to cultural centers. The number of those Russian centers across the continent is still under 10. And with so much focus on political marketing and propaganda, I wonder, how deep and authentic is Russia's soft power compared to its military footprint?
The sense of authenticity tends to come from the fact that it's being perpetuated by groups that are already in country, either speaking in the local languages or youth and activist groups that have some popularity, particularly in urban areas. So if they present a pro-Russian message, say in Bambara or in, the Songo language in the Central African Republic, it's seen as being authentic. But realistically speaking, the level of interaction with Russian propaganda is not as high, especially if you're looking at rural areas or areas where paramilitaries have been accused of carrying out rights abuses. So northern Mali being one example where rights groups are outspoken against alleged abuses by Russian paramilitaries. By contrast, in Bamako, for instance, you will find that key groups like Yerewolo or the CDM will be perpetuating pro-Russian narratives and pro-military government narratives. Same thing in the CAR. The youth movement of the ruling party would hold pro-Russian rallies in Bangui at the height of the Ukraine insurgency, even right now, and in support with the government. This is different from rural populations that sometimes are subjected to heavy-handed tactics by the paramilitaries and by the army, according to most allegations.
Russia's security partnerships apparently often come with resource concessions, access to gold mines in the Central African Republic, for example, in exchange for boots on the ground. Talk to us about how the model works and how extractive it is in practice.
So over the time that the Wagner Group had been operating in the Central African Republic, they were able to go fighting against rebel groups that were overseeing areas with high mineral reserves. And because the Central African Republic had much poorer regulations around whether it's ownership of mines, whether it's controlling the concessions, the Wagner Group was able to capitalize on this and take de facto control of mining areas, but also expand its economic interest. So it wasn't just mining, it was timber, it was livestock. There was even vodka being offered, by contrast with, say, French beer or other French security and economic concessions in the country. They did attempt to replicate that, particularly in Mali, but without as much success. In fact, some of the entities that were established in Mali to possibly go into the mineral sector was sanctioned almost immediately by the West. And by contrast, again, Mali has very strong mining regulations. Russia hasn't quite been able to play a hand in the mineral sector, but they have pledged to help them build a refinery. They have pledged to train some of their technical staff and personnel. And in doing so, they would have an inroad in the sector, but Mali would still maintain a level of operational control. This would still work with being able to gain more revenue because ultimately the arrangement with paramilitaries is about payments. And whether it's through mineral concessions or certain other forms of direct revenue, particularly from countries that are highly dependent on the extractive industry, it would still enable Russia to be able to gain some sort of revenue from its security operations within the region.
Mali is just one of the 3 military-led states in the Sahel, including Burkina Faso and Niger, that have turned squarely to Russia. What about nations just south in the Gulf of Guinea? How big a threat is Russia to the stability in this region and ultimately to sustain democracy there? Could Nigeria, for example, be next?
I mean, for instance, we did see that there had been some protests in the northern part of Nigeria where Russian flags were being waved, and the questions about whether Russia had a hand in some of the anti-government protests. That felt opportunistic. But of course, those opportunistic patterns, which also began in the Sahel, are part of what drove Russia's entry into the region and some of its perceived popularity. Now, Russia itself is playing on both sides. One, it wants to extend its influence within the Western Africa region all the way to the Gulf of Guinea. Lavrov was quite clear about that when he visited Mali about 2 years ago. At the same time, because of those divisions between Russia's paramilitary involvement in the Sahel and the risks of instability in the rest of the ECOWAS region, we're now seeing a real regional split. So the AES, the Alliance of Sahel States, emerging as a contrast, being supported by Russia to ECOWAS, and those geopolitical rifts are likely to heighten because the intra-country relations between the Sahel and some of those West African states is increasingly being undermined both by disinformation supported by Russian trolls, but also because of their contrasting relationships both with Russia and the West. There is a certain threat of stability, political stability, and trust between the governments. But of course, I think many countries are becoming more proactive in finding ways of still maintaining close cooperation with Russia that allows them to have an increase in diplomatic partners and finding pragmatic ways of engaging with the Sahel so the instability there does not become a crisis for the future.
Beverly Ochieng from the Center for Strategic and International Studies. I could talk to you far longer, but we'll have to stop it there. Thank you so much for your analysis.
Thank you so much for having me as well.
Russia also says it will significantly scale up its educational activities with Nigeria and other African countries. It wants to host 500,000 international students at Russian universities, where there are already 32,000 African students. Last September, DW correspondent Fanny Fashar met with some Nigerians who are planning to leave, and we thought you should have another look at her report from 2024.
The Russian consulate in Abuja. Here in Nigeria's capital, locals are queuing up to try to get visas to leave and study in Russia.
Oh, Russia is amazing when it comes to scholarship. They're willing to educate our people at next to nothing.
It's basically the educational system over there. Then also the reception to foreign students, especially Africans.
Filming here is delicate. Most visa applicants we meet don't want to speak on camera, worried it might not be helpful for their applications.
Many of these people putting their hopes in Russia are planning to study there. Now, until a couple of years ago, they'd more likely be wanting to go to Ukraine for further education. But since Russia's full-scale invasion turned Ukraine into a war zone, more are making plans to go to cities like Moscow.
She was like, thank God.
Kingsley stood in that consulate queue last week. Now he's got his Russian visa.
So I was so excited that very day. Like, I wasn't myself anymore. I was just jumping.
There's nothing to keep him in Nigeria.
The job opportunities here is very, very not encouraging. Inflation, even if you get a job, the payments, you can't sustain yourself with it. So I said to myself, do I really need to stay here?
Kingsley's getting ready to go to Novgorod in central Russia in a few weeks. That's where he will learn how to teach English to Russian students. Everything is paid for by Russia, except for the flights, he says.
The scholarship covers the tuition fee, your accommodation, and then you have a stipend, monthly stipend. So I believe with the monthly stipend, I can balance my life at the moment, study, and then get a job there.
The number of students leaving places like this in Africa to study in Russia has tripled in the past decade. Russia's education ministry says there are around 35,000 Africans currently studying in Russia, including more than 1,000 Nigerians. Gali Sharif is researching emerging powers like Russia and their influence in Africa. He says Russia is making it easier to get a visa.
Russia is also doing that to its own advantage. You come, you study, we give you scholarship, join our military, if possible, you give us the support. Of course, every state is after its own national interest. So the interest of Putin is we need more people to come to Russia, help us achieve our goals either in war or in economy.
Kingsley speaks no Russian. His source of information, social media, and a Nigerian friend in Russia.
Yeah, is there anything like it's making you worried, like in terms of the whole political situation via Russia-Ukraine?
Yeah, I'm not seeing any war. Everybody is living their life. There's no problem in Russia.
But Kingsley is worried. He's heard about foreigners who've ended up in the Russian military.
First, if Russia asked me to join the military at some point, I would be shocked. And as a person, I wouldn't go for it because that wasn't my main motive of coming to the country. My motive is to come study for my master's. By the grace of God, I'll be safe.
Nigeria has been a strong ally of the United States. But Western powers are losing influence in the region, and Russia is taking active steps to win African hearts and minds.
Africa is no stranger to coups, and the continent has more than its fair share of military dictatorships, many involving strongmen who are despised by their people. But this seems not to be the case in Burkina Faso, where military leader Ibrahim Traore is building a cult of personality. We've been finding out why he's so popular.
This dude is the man. This dude is the man.
People across Africa and the diaspora are talking about one man. Captain Ibrahim Traore leads the West African nation of Burkina Faso.
We African heads of state must stop behaving like puppets who dance every time the imperialists pull the strings.
Why does his message and his persona resonate so strongly?
I think people are, in essence, they're looking for saviors.
It's easier for them to hear that someone is doing great against imperialism and the Western world and France.
And also, why is there so much misinformation accompanying his fandom? Traore came to power in a 2022 military coup. Two neighboring countries, Mali and Niger, have also had military takeovers and together formed their own regional club. But only one of their leaders has become an icon. He's young and he looks the part, like a revolutionary. Traore echoes Thomas Sankara, the Pan-Africanist and reformist president of Burkina Faso, who was assassinated in 1987. Sankara's supporters accuse France, the former colonial power, of being behind his killing for his Marxist revolutionary stance. Ibrahim Traore preaches a similar message of anti-imperialism and economic sovereignty, and that's music to many people's ears across Africa and beyond. Among Traore's popular moves, kicking out French troops and attempting to rewrite mining contracts to bring in more revenue for Burkina Faso. There's also his focus on agriculture, the country's biggest employer. He's provided farmers with free access to farming equipment, but overall, the country's reality is more complex than many would suggest. The narrative around Traore is riddled with misinformation, and most of the claims about his unprecedented achievements are often one-liners, unverified or outright false, but heavy on emotion. Then there's been the flood of AI videos, some manipulating existing videos of Traore, others made up altogether. In fact, some of the propaganda has been found to be part of a wider disinformation campaign. Journalist Justin Yaga has reported on a Russian-backed propaganda operation that often targeted France's role in Burkina Faso. This intensified around the time Russia began its invasion of Ukraine in 2022.
I remember some people reacting to our investigation saying, we don't care even if there is a propaganda campaign, or the only thing we care is that there are riots about France.
Burkina Faso has since pivoted away from France to Russia, offering gold in return for military support and, as it appears, a propaganda machine, one the Russians knew would appeal to Africans.
The investigation we did was like discovering, the ground. I think a lot of other initiative, propaganda campaign are now built on these grounds.
While social media celebrates Traore, it's a different story in his country, which has become more dangerous with a worsening crisis of ethnic and jihadist violence. In fact, it was on this very issue that Traore came to power. He criticized his predecessors for failing to stop the insecurity. But conditions have actually deteriorated under his rule. Burkina Faso is the country worst affected by terrorism, according to this year's Global Terrorism Index. And experts estimate about half of its territory is outside of government control. Human rights groups have also accused the army of carrying out atrocities against civilians. Yet such news only provokes Traore's supporters and sparks their claims that this is all a witch hunt.
If you pay attention when all this initiative comes out, when they start communicating on something that Traore have done, and it's more connected to some failures. So for me, I think it's a way to hide what's happening really on the ground. It's also telling people what they want to hear. I think it's easier for them to hear that someone is doing great against imperialism and the Western world and France. There is no one who would say, I miss this time or the colonial time. People want things to change, so that's sure.
What the outside world might not know is Traore's regime is clamping down on independent local voices from political parties, civil society, and the media. We've reached out to several journalists and analysts in Burkina Faso for this story, but they all express fear of repercussions from the regime if they spoke to us. Reporters Without Borders notes a rapid deterioration of the media environment since the military took over. It says news favorable to Traore has taken precedence over rigorous journalism, and adds that the deteriorating security situation has led journalists to face increasing pressure and abuses, fostering self-censorship within the profession. Those who question the government are punished. Among them, these journalists were forcibly recruited into the security forces and sent to the front line to fight jihadists. But Traore is not pretending to offer the freedoms that democracy provides. In fact, quite the opposite. He's gone back on his promise to usher in elections to restore a civilian government, declaring he'll remain in power as military leader for another 5 years.
We've got to say it loud and clear. We're not in a democracy. We're in a popular progressive revolution. If anyone can name a single country that's developed in a democracy, it's not possible. Democracy is only the end result.
But Africa has traveled this road before. For decades after independence, military strongmen made similar promises of revolution and then hung on to power at the expense of their countries and their people. A history that might not be vivid in the eyes of today's generation.
I think people are, in essence, they're looking for saviors. And this is kind of part of my discomfort with this polarization of people like Ibrahim Traore. People have to be careful about propping up these figures as panaceas to what are essentially systemic problems.
Many Africans are dissatisfied with what their current democratic systems are delivering as they witness corruption, poor governance, and even repression.
And let's not ignore the grievances that exist, but it's really how we frame them and how we talk about how they're going to be resolved. So it's not just let's get good leaders, it's let's actually get systems that can both contain the people who control power, make them genuinely accountable to the people within within the continent.
But criticism of Ibrahim Traore currently doesn't appear to faze his supporters. To them, he represents an ideal. This movement is what emerges when a generation stops believing in the systems designed to serve them and chases after a symbol of hope, regardless of the risks attached.
We're going to end it there, but there's always a lot more. Be sure to check out our other stories on dw.com/Africa, or of course on social media. We'll see you next time. Bye for now.